I mean, that goes all into these already preconceived notions within Christianity of what it means to be human, and the Manichaean divides between like man and woman that are always opposite, between man and nature, the between the good Christian and the evil outsider, the other, the savage, the slave. And in many ways that type of Manichaean like belief goes into two of the greatest fears of like Christianity, which is like death and nature. I think like one thing that I found interesting, and we'll come back to the question of heteronormativity, because that goes into like how like the human concept of like the concept of the human was developed. But the Christian fear of death in many ways is contradictory if you have like this concept of the afterlife. Why have a fear if the afterlife is in some ways better than this life? Um, rather, and when there's when it seems to be apparent that like death should be welcome, it seems to be the opposite, because there's this like massive fear of dying and of being killed off, I think. And there's this interesting line, um when I find it, I think it was very enlightening. But he talked well, essentially Deloria was trying to explain that death in many ways was the destruction of one's identity, and one's identity, but like the destruction of both the body meant also the destruction of the soul. And that in some ways, and but there's also the idea that like that type of if the temporal if the Christian is destroyed, and the thus it also means that the soul of the nation, the project that is being built, will also be destroyed. And that it no longer becomes one of just um, my own individual death, but there's also this type of civilizational war. This like this war, the clash of civilization that you would have like with like Huntington. Um, but this is taken on a metaphysical level, because now it's the two concepts of the historical and the space, the temporal and the spatial, fighting it out. But you have also this type of view that like that nature itself is something that must be tamed, that it is because of its otherness, it must be brought within history itself. And this is done through that is done through industrialization. But you also see like that is done through industrialization, whereas with indigenous peoples, there's the view that death itself is not outside of what is good, but is rather the natural inevitable process of just living. And there's a Kiowa chief that Deloria cites, where he says where a Kiowa chief is about to die after being taken a prisoner in Texas, and he sings this death chant, and he says, "Oh sun, you remain forever, but we Kaitsenko must die. Oh earth, you remain forever, but we Kaitsenko must die." Now that could be seen as very somber and very saddening, which it is, but it also shows the values that Delors is trying to explain. That that indigenous religions have a specific emphasis on a specific ontological emphasis of indigenous peoples are part of nature, and to escape that is to and to escape that in some ways is to live in irreality. In some ways, these types of religious views preempt concepts such as existentialism, of viewing the inevitability of one's own death as part of one's own creation. But it also shows that one values and creates one's own worth, not through the individual self, but through what Deleuze says, through external, more eternal structures, the earth, the sun, which will remain. And if those will remain, then why is there a fear? Then one's own death is a small speck within like the grand scheme of things. It's that concept that you see, like that you probably will see, like Facebook, like you see how big the universe is, like how small you are. The Earth is like 1 trillionth of the size of like the entire galaxy, and then you have to count the universe. That's the West's attempt to try to reach that point, which indigenous peoples have already done through through the tribe through community, through the tribal rituals ethic that have been like sewed in for centuries, that millennia, which Christianity, after which is starting to be questioned both in the 70s and now, but to no avail. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why you also do have this type of nihilism that's coming about in the 21st century too, which is why I think Deloria's work is very important. It shows that Christianity, like, he might not say it specifically in these terms, but there is a certain nihilism that's coming out from the failures of Christianity to resolve the experience, or to resolve its own contradictions. This fear, like, God is sacred, but the earth and nature is not. One's own, heaven is beautiful. It's either a holy court of angels, or it's like, he says, jokingly, like, it's just suburbia, but with like all of the bad parts out of it, but also still having that fear of death. And that inability to resolve that contradiction in some ways creates that nihilism that we can see in like white supremacist violence, especially with like white supremacist eco terrorism, like, oh, we must destroy the wrong races to save the earth, when the problem is that Western culture itself has already deemed nature as evil. And also, the only way that nature can be tamed is if we have the right stewardship of the land. Not Whereas Deloria says the problem isn't how we control it; it's how do we let go of that control so that we can be go into these natural cycles. How can we affirm the life not just of ourselves but of all of the other beings, larger and smaller, outside of us?
Yeah, and just to kind of build on that point, he makes this strong argument against the idea of original sin, and how Adam and Eve. He doesn't say this in the book, but it's like, Adam is basically corrupted by the sins of Eve, essentially, for eating the apple and all this, and the snake. Um, but he makes this argument to go back kind of the spatial theory of history. He's like, well, where did that happen? Like, where was the Garden of Eden? And you can ask a Christian today, and they'll be like, oh, Mesopotamia. They don't know,
Yeah,
right? They don't have an idea of where these events took place. And he makes this argument that how unmoored Christian history is to actual history on this physical plane. And I think he actually makes a strong argument here to say that Indian religions are much more materialist and grounded in reality, because they can point to, oh, this history, this river, this is what happened here, and this is why it happened. We don't know when it happened, but we know that it happened here. Whereas Christianity can't say, like, you know, it can't open its book, its primary book, and say, like, this happened here and this is why it happened. It's kind of been mythologized to the point of complete abstraction.
yeah. Which is why you
Much,
have like priests always saying the end of times is coming on like May 14th, 2020. Like, if
yeah,
let's see if that's real, but like
yeah,
that type of spatial reasoning, like everything is within the book. You have to extract reality and then cut it in, like cookie cutter it into the biblical narrative. And then you always have those failures of like, well, I must have interpreted the date wrong, rather than think, well, maybe the world is more complex than what the Bible is actually saying.